In this lesson, we'll continue on with our Node.js Web Server implementation, and the next step is for us to implement our post route handling. The first thing I think about when I think about implementing this part of our app is how are we going to test it? How are we going to try things out? So let's have a look again at Postman and figure out how we use Postman to send data to our server. So if we have a look at Postman, so far what we've done is we've sent GET requests. And what we want to test now is sending POST requests. So there are a couple of things that we need to change here. So we'll be sending a POST on the student's route. And the first thing we'll change is the GET to a POST. The second thing that we'll have to do is we'll have to send over the student that we want to post. So right now in this body section of the request properties, we have none selected. If we want to send some data, we are going to send some JSON data. It's just, it's the most handy way to send data across when we're doing testing, and most likely the data that we'll be sending from our clients. So we will choose raw as the data type, and instead of text, we're going to send JSON. Now, what we're going to type here in this text box is the data we want to send. Now, we're sending JSON, so we have to have a property and a value. So we'll use name as the property, and then we will provide a name for the value. Now, you notice that Postman will give me a little red X that lets me know that there's a problem with my JSON. So that's handy too. It gives us some information. So now we're all set up to send a POST request with Postman. Pretty easy, right? Not too bad. So we make sure that we have the right URL in the address bar here, a post and some data, and we're ready to go. So how are we going to implement this post route handling? Well, first of all, we could add an else if block in our callback function in our create server to handle post on the URL that we expect, and we'll console log that we received that request, and we can set the header. So let's do that. In our app.js, we're going to add, before our final else block that catches our invalid routes, we'll add another else if and what we're going to check for is that method is post and URL is students, and when that's the case, we want to do our post route handling. Now we're going to have to take the data that comes across from our client. That's what we want to do. It'll be a student name. We know now that it's going to be in this in the form of JSON with a name property and the value of the name that we want to use. But how is that data going to come across exactly, and how are we going to get that data? So we've got to work that out. But for now, we'll console log that we responding to a post on students. So we'll set that up, and what we're going to send back to our client in the case that we get this post is our updated list of students. So similar to what we did for get on students, we'll set the content type to application JSON, and now we're set up to send back this response for post. But first we have to work out how do we get the data and update our list of students. So in order to figure that out, we need to talk about how we process post data. So the request that the request object that comes through the connection callback is a stream, and when our client sends data with a post, that stream is going to contain that data. And when data comes across, we will have a data event get triggered on the request. And what we have to do is we have to add a listener basically to that data event. And when the data event occurs, we will get the chunk of data because the data that comes across is in chunks. And so we'll get a chunk of data when this data event fires, and we'll process that data. Now, we could receive data in multiple chunks, and we have to be able to detect when we're done receiving data so that we can finish up processing of what we got. And the way that we do that is we listen to the end event on the request. So that end event is triggered once when the request is complete. So if we add a listener to that end event, we know that the data streaming is also done. We can take all of our data chunks and process them and do what we want to do with them. In this case, we will be looking for the student name in the data and adding that to our array of students. So we first of all, let's have a look and figure out what this data actually looks like. So inside of our callback function, after we've handled the routes, we're going to add some handling for the data. So handle data from post request on students. That's what we're going to do here. So we're going to add an event listener on the data event. And we know that that data event is going to come with a chunk of data. So we'll create a variable to store that chunk of data. And every time we get a chunk of data, this data event will fire. So for the moment, let's just have a look at it. So console log received data chunk, and let's see what it looks like so we know what to do with it. So let's have a look at our server. Our server is still running. We've set it up to run with NodeMon and with Forever, so it restarts every time we make a change to our server. That's handy. We don't have to restart it anymore. Now let's go to Postman and let's send over this request and see what happens. Let's have a look. So we got our post on students. We're responding to a post on students. We just added that in our else if block. And here we go, receive chunk of data. Ooh, that's weird, isn't it? So what we got here is some data in a stream. So it's encrypted, and we just see some hex numbers, and we can't do anything with this, can we? So let's see what we can do. Well, one thing that actually works is if we parse this chunk using JSON parse. Let's look at what happens. We go, our server restarted. Did you catch that when we made the change? That's very nice. Let's send that post request again and have a look at what we got. Ah, that's much better, isn't it? So this parsed that stream of data, turned it into a JSON object for us, and we know how to work with this, don't we? Very good. So now we know that in this particular application, we're just expecting to get one student name, and this will come across in one chunk. But instead of painting ourselves into a corner, and so that we develop a sort of general solution for this, we are going to handle this data as if we're not sure how many chunks we're going to get, and we're going to potentially process multiple chunks. So one way to do that, and you'll find this if you Google, a common way to do this is to create an array that we can store these chunks in. So when we get a chunk of data, we'll just push it into this array, and we'll parse it before we push it, so that what we store in this array is something that we recognize. So we'll parse the chunk, we'll push it into this data array, and we can log what's in this data array to make sure that we're doing the right things. So contents of data array, and we'll log that. All right, so our server's restarting away. It's happy. Let's send another post and look at what we got, and here we go. This is pretty much what we expect. So we have a single object in our data array, and it's what was sent by the post request. So this is good. Now here's one thing to notice. let's say that we post it on llamas. What do you think is going to happen? Well, you might think that since in our route handling here, we are sending a route not found, that we're going to ignore the data. But let's see if that's what actually happens. So first of all, we have a problem because we sent it and we're not getting anything back. So this is working. If we, this isn't working, sorry, this isn't working because let's look at what is happening. Now, let's try that one more time. So if we send it on llamas, okay, I think I just had a little bit of a hiccup there, that this is what I expected to happen. So we did get that the route wasn't found on llamas, but we also grabbed the chunk of data. And that's because these two things are not really connected to each other. This is, this callback here is being triggered. The callback in our create server is being triggered whenever we get a request. And we've gotten a request, and we're doing the checking here in our conditional logic, and we see, okay, this isn't a route that we recognize, so we send back a 404. And if we look at Postman, we can see that we did indeed get a 404 back and a route not found. But this callback here is on something completely different. This is a callback on an event listener for this data event, and a data event did occur. So we still received the chunk of data, and we just happily stuck it in our data array, which we will process later to update our students array. That's not really what we want. So we need to add some conditional logic here that says if URL is students is the only time that we want to pay attention to any data that comes. So let's wrap this code here in our event handler in a conditional so that we're only going to handle data if it comes across on a URL that we expect. So let's try that again from Postman. If we send the request, so we get a route not found, and we ignore the data. Look at that, we've just ignored it. We can convince ourselves that that's what happened by putting an else here that says console log received data but ignoring it. So let's save that and try again. And we can see that we received data but we're ignoring it. Fantastic. Okay, so now when we get a chunk of data, we are putting it into our data array, but we still need to take that data and push it into our student array. Where's the right place to do that? Well, it isn't really here. Even though we get the data here, we really want to wait for that end event. So let's add another event listener on end. And in the callback for this event listener, we want to basically process the end of our post request. So we're going to process the end of a post request on students. Okay, so what we need to do here is we need to take the student name, push it into our student array, and then send that updated student information, student list, back to our client. Now we only want to do all those things if we actually got some data. And so one way we can tell that is if the length of our data array is greater than 0. So let's say that if data.length is greater than 0, that means that we've done some processing of a data chunk. And we only do processing of the data chunk when we've gotten the request on a valid URL. So let's say that if the data length is greater than 0, notice we crashed over here because it detected a change in my app and I hadn't completed the syntax. So that's all right. So here, if data length is greater than 0, what we want to do is we want to take the data out of our data array. Now, we know from running this before that what we get back is a single element array. So that's all we need to pay attention to. So we'll say let student equal data, the 0th element. Now the 0th element is going to return this object, and the only piece of information we want from that is the value associated with the name property, in this case Natalie. So if we refer to the data array, the 0th element dot name, that should be the name of our student, and we can check that. Got student name, student. So let's see if that comes back the way we want. Now sometimes forever just can't recover, and in this case it was just because I hadn't finished typing, and it detected the change and it got a syntax error and couldn't recover from it. So I've had to restart my server, but still this is still saving me some work. All right, so let's make sure that what we get here, if we send it on students on the correct path, that what we get is the name. Look at that. So now we're storing that student name in our student variable here. This is just a local variable in this block. And we just want to push that into our array. So we can just say students push student. And that's going to push this new student into our array. All that's left to do is to send this updated student array back to our client, similar to the way that we have done it for a GET request on /students. So what we want to do here is we'll want to say res and JSON parse students. Now one thing we want to do before we do that is we want to set the status code. So first let's have a look at what happens here. So from Postman, if we send this request now, we have a problem. So let's see what I've done. I've got a typo potential. Oh, so I can't send a JSON parse in this case because it have we set the content type? We have set the content type to application JSON. We need to not JSON parse. That was silly, wasn't it? We need to stringify. We're sending information back, not receiving it and working on it. So see, even experienced developers make silly mistakes sometimes, so don't feel bad. Okay, let's try that one more time. Our server's restarted. We'll send it again. Now it's happy. And if we look in Postman, we can see that we got back our updated list of students. That's exciting, isn't it? Look, Natalie's added there. That's wonderful, fantastic. But here's what I want you to notice is that we've sent back a 200 OK. So this isn't quite the appropriate response to send back when we create something. Let's consult status dogs. So when we create a resource, we really want to send back a 201 status code. That is the correct thing to do. So how can we do that? Here, before we send back our stringified students, not parsed, we'll just say res status code equals 201. Because at this point, we know we have actually created a resource. We've added a student to our array of students. We set the status code to 201, send back the student, and now if we go to Postman, we'll make sure our server's running. It is. We go to Postman. Let's try adding a different name. I will add, I'll add my own name here. We'll send it across. That works. It comes back on the list, and we got our 201 status code. Brilliant. So now we have implemented our post route handling. Fantastic. Way to go.